So, welcome everyone. And just wanted to kick off today's episode with a statistic that just landed on my desk this week. And it absolutely stopped me mid-track because it said this: 65% of leaders would rather appear decisive and get it wrong than admit uncertainty and get it right. Just sit with that for a second. 2/3 of the leaders in this research would choose to look good over being right. And of course, it's not because they're bad leaders, but it's because the system trained them to believe that looking uncertain is more dangerous than being wrong. And that, when you just think about that for me really explains a lot of what we see going on in the world today, with people not speaking up and sharing why they think a decision might be wrong. And at the same time as this, there's another piece of research that came out this week, which was this: invisibility is no longer read as neutral. So what does it mean by that? What it's really talking about is that when a leader goes quiet, a leader doesn't say anything, people don't think they're being careful. What actually, people have become really skeptical and think, oh, the leader is hiding something. So if we put these two findings next to each other, we get a bit of a problem, don't we? And that's what I want to talk about today. Because on one hand, we're telling leaders that they need to be more visible than ever, because that's how they're credible. They're more visibility. People get to know and trust them. And at the same moment, people are more terrified than ever of being seen about getting something wrong. So we've got these two opposing views out there at the moment. And I don't think this is a communication problem. I actually think it's a credibility problem. And it sits right at the heart of what I help leadership teams work through. So, welcome back to this week's edition of Impactful Teamwork. And I'm Julia Felton, and this is the show where we take what is happening in terms of research and the boardroom, and we hold it up against what I've learned watching leadership teams, and yes, my horse herds, who actually navigate uncertainty together. So today I'm going to pull apart these two pieces of research that have landed for me. Because as I said, one really says that leaders need to show up and be seen and be human and be imperfect. And on the other hand, we're saying most leaders would rather perform and pretend that they're confident they know what's happening than admit they don't have the answer. And so what I want to explore today is why these two things aren't actually in conflict, and why resolving the tension between them is where the real credibility and teamship gets built within your organization. So let's start with the first piece of research that got the most attention. And this is an article that was written in Forbes by a gentleman called Doug Melville. And he was asking whether visibility has become the new credibility for C-suite leaders. And his argument went something along the lines of this: that for decades, senior leaders have been trained to communicate only when their message was polished and approved and strategically timed. The CEO generally spoke through the annual report, and typically in the past, the chief communications officer has handled anything in the public domain. And internal updates are filtered through layer after layer review. So what's been happening is the higher up the hierarchy that people have climbed, your visibility has become more and more managed. We might even argue it's your lack of visibility has become managed. And so what Melville talks about in this article in Forbes is that era is ending. And he actually points to a discussion that happened in Cannes earlier this year, where one of the biggest topics that was discussed was the need for C-suite leaders to behave more like influencers. And clearly not because it's fashionable to be an influencer, but because clients, team members, partners, and investors no longer only want to engage with the brand voice, they want to see the people behind the voice. They want to know that the people leading the organization actually believe in what the business stands for. And also they want to know that the leaders really are paying attention to what is happening in the greater world around them. And there was a line in the article that I think really resonated the most for me, and it's this, that in this kind of environment, invisibility isn't read as neutral. It's read as a choice to create distance. So when leaders are rarely seen or heard, people don't sit in a comfortable silence, patiently waiting for news. They fill that void with assumptions, and that absence gets interpreted as avoidance. And I know from my own experience, when people have the opportunity to fill this gap, they make up stories that often aren't true. And so people get to a completely different assumption about what is happening than what is actually the truth. And there's a gentleman in the article called Rob Schwartz, and he's the former CEO of TWBA Cheer Day. And what he says is the best CEOs are storytellers in the company. And the reason they're storytellers is because a story is different from a speech. A speech is polished, a story is human. And the leaders who keep telling their story, even when they're tired of telling it, are the ones that people finally listen to and finally absorb the story. And JJ Carter, who's the CEO of Fleischmann Hillard, also adds to the discussion by saying, empty promises have never been more damaging. Storytelling that is disconnected from operational truth is just noise. Authenticity equals accountability. And effective leaders have to be willing to own their own missteps and own it when things don't go to plan. So what did I notice about this, and what is something I'd like you to take away from this? It's that every example given within this research in Forbes is about powerful, visible credibility. But it's not about leaders being polished. It's about leaders being imperfect in public on purpose. It's about leaders being vulnerable. It's about leaders sharing about what they're learning and explaining how they are thinking through something before they've finished thinking it through. So we all know that we live in a world that is changing at crazy speed. And we're living in an environment which leaders have never been through before. None increase in AI and how that's impacting people. And what the research has shown is that stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, they don't really want a finished perfect leader. They really want to know what the beliefs, what they're building, and how they think. And I think that this is really important. We build that credibility and trust by letting people behind the curtain and letting people see how we think and how we believe and how we're actually building our organizations. And there was another really interesting piece of research that came in, which was that 99% of CEOs expect to reduce headcount due to AI over the next 2 years. So in other words, this is not a calm moment where leaders can afford to wait until they're completely certain to speak. And this is exactly the moment where the silence will be the loudest. So leaders that wait and don't say anything about what's going on in their organizations, they might even be perceived as sticking their head in the sand and ignoring what is going on. So I think what I'm taking away from this research is something very simple, is that leadership requires presence. And in the work with the horses, we always talk about the horses require us to be present. And I think what I'm seeing changing now is that leaders being present is extending beyond the boardroom, is onto social media platforms, it's onto the conversations that leaders are having with their teams and their clients. Because leaders who understand the power of presence are not winning because they're more polished. They're winning because they're being more honest about not being polished and showing their vulnerability. And this brings me to the second piece of research, because if honest, imperfect visibility is the thing that builds trust, Why are 2 out of 3 leaders still choosing to fake certainty instead? So here's the tension that's going on right now. We know that showing up imperfect and honest builds more credibility than showing up polished and distant. And I think leaders should be relieved by it. It means you don't have to have all the answers before you open your mouth. And this is why I've been such a massive proponent of shared leadership, because it does mean that as a leader, you don't have to have all of the answers. I think the problem that still exists out there is that most leaders don't believe that they don't have to have all the answers. Most leaders are still terrified of the moment when they have to say out loud, I don't know. And that fear isn't a personality flaw. It's a system that's been quietly trained into every leadership team I've ever worked with. So what is the research that names this precisely? And it's called the Decisiveness Crisis. And it comes from some research by Sam Conniff and Catherine Templer-Lewis. And is in their work, Uncertainty Experts. And it draws on a study of more than 1,000 leaders, and it builds on academic work from Bilvish and DeWitt for the Chartered Institute of Personal Development. And that headline number is the one that I opened the episode with, which was 65% of leaders would rather appear decisive than get it wrong, than admit uncertainty and get it right. And what the research showed was this ratio holds across every sector, every seniority level, and every gender. This is not one bad boss. This is close to 2/3 of the leadership population choosing the appearance of certainty over the substance of being correct. And the research refers to this as the certainty theater. And I think their framing is really important because this isn't a leadership failure, it's a system problem. It's about the pressure to appear certain and how it's built into how every organization works, how every promotion happens, how every board asks questions, how every performance review is structured. Nobody asks a leader to sit down and say to them in so many words, please blag being confident, even if you don't feel it. But the problem is the structure of the way that we're enumerating people says it's for them every single day. And the cost to the business is not small, because this research also found that 74% of transformation programs fail because of uncertainty-driven resistance. Not because the strategy was wrong, because somewhere in the leadership layer, people were pretending to be more certain than they were. And that pretense quietly poisoned the decision-making underneath it. And as I say that, I think about a lot of the government projects out there where people are quietly believing that their projects are going to run on time. And that is what they are telling everyone because they don't want to admit that the project is off track. So why do people not want to admit when a project is off track and they try and delude themselves that something else is happening? Marlene Chisholm, a leadership expert, explains the mechanism because she talks about the distinction between uncertainty and shame. And uncertainty says, I don't know, whereas shame says, it's wrong that I don't know. And let's go back to neuroscience here, because neuroscience tells us that the brain does not treat uncertainty as neutral information. It treats it as a threat. So the brain will choose bad certainty over genuine unknown, even in a potentially positive outcome. So what does this mean? And this is what we're seeing a lot in business right now, is it means that before a leader has even had a chance to think clearly, their body has already decided that not knowing is dangerous. And once shame attaches itself to that moment, the leader stops operating from curiosity. They start operating from protection. They delay decisions to avoid exposure. They shut down inputs because inputs might surface something that they're already afraid of. They default to control because control feels safer than conversation. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that situation that you've come across where leaders have exactly dropped into this place. The fear of not knowing has actually made them shut down, and they've started operating from a place of protection in order to stop them being exposed as not knowing what's happening. And I've been there personally, because when I worked at Arthur Andersen and we went through the collapse of Arthur Andersen during Enron, every instinct in me wanted to project total composure. And for a while, I did. I was pretending to my team that I knew what was going to happen with my business unit and that we were all going to be safe, where actually I had no idea. I didn't know what was going to happen next. And what I did experience along that journey was actually the fact that being bold and brave and saying to my team, I don't know what is going to happen. And yes, our division might be made redundant. I really don't know. Actually, when I took on that level of vulnerability and shared that, it was really empowering for my team members, because they felt seen, they felt heard, but more importantly, they felt they had choices. They could make a choice to decide whether to stay with the organization and ride through the wave and see what happened, or they had a choice to jump ship. And while that was really difficult for me as a leader to watch, it was actually very empowering to see people being able to make their own decisions about what they wanted to do. So I think here is where two pieces of research meet. Visibility without honesty about uncertainty is not credibility. It's just better produced certainty theatre, right? And the leaders who we're willing to trust right now, they're not the ones who show up more often. They're the ones who are saying in public, here is what I don't know yet. And that's a much smaller group of people. It might be as small as 35%. But it's a group whose team actually move because the team feel heard, they feel valued, and they feel trusted, that the leader is actually prepared to share with them that they don't know what might happen in the business. But they're also the leaders who are managing to get more engagement out of team members and get team members to actually offer up ideas for how we can move the business forward. So as I said, this fear of making decisions for being seen wrong is a teamship problem, and it's not a personality problem. Because I don't really think that fundamentally it's a communications issue or even a courage issue. I think it's a teamship issue. When a leader performs certainty they don't have, they're not just managing their own reputation, they're actually training their entire leadership team on what is and what is not allowed in the room. So if the person at the top can't say, I'm not sure, nobody underneath them is going to say either. So what happens is every uncertainty in the business gets quietly held by the individuals instead of it getting surfaced and shared. And that is cooperation, not co-ownership. We see this all the time. When everyone attends the meeting, everyone nods. But nobody really names the real thing that's going to move the decision forward. Because the person who would need to model that has already shown them that it's not safe to do it. So many of you will know that I often talk about the difference between teamwork and teamship. So teamwork is something people do, but teamship is something a group becomes. And a leadership team cannot become anything together while its leader is the only one allowed to look certain. So co-ownership requires that the uncertainty be shared out aloud in the room before it's resolved. And we don't want this presented afterward as a decision that's already been made. And this is exactly what I've watched again in the work I do with the horses. The horse herd has been navigating uncertainty for millions of years. not through one confident animal issuing instructions from the front, but through shared leadership and collective awareness. The attention rotates to whichever horse is best placed to read the movement actually required. No horse in the herd is actually performing certainty it doesn't have. It would get found out immediately. Herd animals cannot fake it because the rest of the herd is reading the body language, not just the performance. And the thing is, leadership teams are exactly the same. The problem is we're just a little better at hiding it, at least for a short period of time. So if you're listening to this episode today and you're thinking about your own leadership team, here is the question underneath both pieces of research today. And the question is not, how do I show up more? And it's also not, how do I look more confident? The question underneath this is, what happens in your leadership team right now, the moment somebody says, I don't know? Does the room go quiet in a bad way? Or does that person get quietly punished or redirected? Or maybe somebody reaches to say something certain to cover the gap. I suspect it's not that the room leads in, because not knowing together has been made safe. Because the data is clear on both sides of this now. Staying invisible reads as distance. Staying certain when you're not reads as theatre. So the only position left that actually builds trust is the one that most leaders have been trained for their entire career to believe is dangerous. And that is the position of being seen and being honestly unfurnished and vulnerable. So here's what I'd ask for you to do this week, whichever seat you sit in. If you lead a team, find one live decision right now where you generally do not have the full picture and say it aloud in the room to your team before you've resolved it. Not as a confession, but as an invitation. So it might sound something like, here's what we don't know yet. Let's think this through together and watch what happens in the room. And if you're further down the leadership team, watching your leader perform certainty they clearly do not feel. Notice that the fix is not to call it out, but it's to model the thing that you want to see. Be the one who says, I'm not sure, without apologizing for it. Somebody has to go first. And it doesn't have to be the most senior person in the room. It just has to be someone. And once somebody goes first, then everybody will follow on, because actually we know that often the people closest to the front line have all of the answers. But all too often we're still relying on senior leadership to have the answers, and they don't. And it's okay. And I'd like to give you a permission slip to say, it is okay to say you are not sure and to bring your team on board. The caveat I would make was, if you're saying that each and every single day, then your team might lose trust that you actually know what you're doing at all in your role. But to be saying this intermittently and explaining the context of, this is happening, we've never done it before, we're starting to embrace AI, for example, we've never used this before, I'm not quite sure how it's going to work out, but this is how we're going to try and do it. That builds trust and credibility with your team. So as we bring this podcast to a close, just a reminder that your leadership team is the most expensive underperforming system you have in your business. And certainty theatre is the most expensive habit inside of it. And it's not because people are lying. And it's not because everyone has learned the honesty about not knowing as a risk. It's not. The research says the opposite. The leaders people trust the most are not the ones with the fewest gaps. They're the ones willing to be seen with the gaps still open. So if this episode resonated with you and you recognize something in your own leadership team, maybe it's the meeting where everyone agrees and nothing moves, or the decision that keeps landing back on your desk, or the sense that your team cooperates but never has quite learned to co-own, then I genuinely love to have a conversation with you. You can start by taking the Turbocharge Your Team audit at businesshorsepower.com/quiz. And you'll also find a link in the show notes, or just drop me a message directly. Either way, let's together have a proper look at where the certainty theatre might be quietly running your leadership team. And come back next week. Tell me what you found out, because I'd love to explore that with you further. So until next week, have an amazing time. Bye-bye.